For me, this is important, removing all this decoration that has perhaps been added to mediumship over many years. To me, mediumship will be the WhatsApp of the 22nd century. So we were doing a live on Instagram, and at the top, it kept showing 1,101 followers and around that number. I mean, it would go down and up, 11, 11 all the time, right? It would drop by 10 at most, then go up by 10. Then there came a moment when suddenly it dropped to 40, and then a second later, it went back up to 11, 11. So it was like, how strange. And then I realized that the comments, there were hardly any comments. So if there had been 1,000 people connected to the live, there would have been a lot. And there was a comment every minute, every so often. So and I said, wow, you know what? I think your daughter Sophie is showing herself through the numbers. And it was about 10 numbers below, more or less. So I said, it live, it's recorded. I said, please, Sophie, can you go back up to 11, 11 again? And boom, 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 boom. In 5 seconds, it had gone up to 11, 11. I said, wow.
When we come from a very structured and rational family, it's very hard for us to understand that there can be things that reason alone can't explain, that our physical eyes can't see. And when at that moment someone talks to us about mediums, we usually associate them with charlatans or scammers until something profound happens to us in life, something intimate, intense, that shakes us to our core and makes us completely rethink the way we approached life or viewed these topics. We might even end up dedicating ourselves to what we do today. That happened to me many years ago, but not only to me, it also happened to the guest we have with us today. With him, we'll discuss this topic and all of his experience as a medium. Iker, welcome to Low Invisible.
Hello, hello. Thank you very much, Esteban.
Iker, what was your first experience as a medium that you remember?
Okay, well, now that I think back a little, there were actually 2 or 3 strange things that happened in my life before I discovered that I could communicate with the deceased. In 2013, 2 days, well, actually, 1 day after my paternal grandmother passed away, we were at her house after the funeral. And the whole family gathered in a circle just to remember her and talk about things. So while we were talking, suddenly I heard from her room a voice saying, "Chiquitas, chiquitas," she said it once. And that's how she used to call my cousins, who were also there in that circle. It was strange, but honestly, since I didn't think this kind of thing could exist, I didn't really give it much importance. But it turns out that I was recording that conversation because I really liked what they were talking about. And that night I said, I'm going to check to see if this was actually recorded, right? If it's something real or just something I imagined. And we started to analyze it. And it turns out that no, you can't hear the word chiquita, but instead on 3 occasions you can hear it say Marco, Marco, which was the way she used to say, I'm leaving. It was the same tone also in her last days or years. She had suffered from respiratory problems and had to speak very softly, like, so of course this is something I just put aside, and I don't know, I didn't give it any importance. Now I don't understand why, but well, actually yes, because I didn't know either. To me, mediums were charlatans, people just out to make money, snake oil salesmen, people who appeared on TV, showbiz types, all of that, right? So it was in 2023 when I was researching, when I was watching TikTok, that I came across a medium who was just a normal medium in her living room, dressed normally with evidential proof, which I didn't even know could exist. And it really caught my attention, despite this rejection, who had the mediums. And it caught my attention, and I said, I'm going to try a session, to book a session and see what happens, because I'm very curious. And even if I didn't believe in it, I wanted to see if it was real or not. And in this session was wonderful. All my deceased loved ones appeared, 5 specifically, who were the most important to me, especially my maternal grandmother, showing me something in her hand that was very significant, something only she and I knew about, an inside joke we shared. So, of course, after that day, my mind was like, well, what do I do? How do I fit this into my life, you know? What place do I give it? Then, coincidentally, the following month, she was offering an introductory course on mediumship. And I started taking this course, and it turned out that things would come to me with a certain ease. Of course, at the beginning, it wasn't like it is now, you know? It takes a bit more effort for the evidence to come through. But the evidence would come to me very clearly. And in fact, I always felt inferior because the rest of my classmates had either had experiences as children or they had seen their deceased grandparents right in front of them. So I didn't have any of that, and I felt kind of inferior. And it was such a high when I discovered that I could also do this naturally. After that, I went on to take 2 more courses, a bit more professional, so to speak, more in depth, right? And I discovered that this was my passion, that this is what makes me happy, helping people in such a powerful way, in such a different way, you know, different from what we're used to maybe.
And maybe so clear, right?
When I started down the path of mediumship, it was incredible because everything just started to open up. I always say it was like walking on butter. Someone calls you for an interview. Someone else calls you for a session. Everything just seems to flow. And I had never felt that in my life before. I had never felt like I was fulfilling my life's mission.
You know, what you're saying is interesting because I believe that we all have something to do here. It's part of our soul's plan. That's what I call it, ni. And when you get on that path, everything just flows. I call it beneficial synchronous flow. And when you stray from that path, everything gets stuck, everything gets blocked, everything becomes complicated. That's very true. So, from what I understand, for you, it wasn't very traumatic, unlike what happens to other mediums who question it a lot. I mean, it's like you opened up and you really opened up completely, just like that.
Exactly. I'm lucky that I didn't have those childhood nightmares, that I didn't have that kind of trauma, you know? In my childhood with the deceased, I didn't have those experiences of seeing unpleasant things since I never went through that. And all my life, it was just there in the background, blocked or wherever. So I consider myself lucky, you know? I approach mediumship with love, with respect, and I set aside all those negative aspects, the lower astral energies, all of that.
That's right. Hey, but you know what? Well, you say you don't have any memories, maybe of childhood experiences, but I would venture to say that you surely do. What happens is that either you've forgotten them, or probably, since you didn't associate them with these topics, you understood them in a different way. But I've noticed that people who are mediums and are clearly mediums in general, always, everyone I know, have had experiences as children, and often, over time, it starts to make sense. Because at first, I also thought that I didn't have any childhood experiences, but then my mom would say, "How could you not? Just think about what used to happen to you." And I would say, yes, you're right. I didn't associate it with my mediumship, but it's actually quite common. You see, Iker.
Yes, for me, that's a dilemma I always have, you know? Is this something innate or is it something that developed later? Of course, it's true that I don't remember too many things from when I was little. There was one time, actually, when I dreamed about a witch coming down the hallway, and when I woke up really scared, my ankle hurt a lot. My ankle hurt because that was the one the witch was grabbing, right? So that was definitely strange. And like you said, you start discovering things. Maybe that's the stage I'm in right now, you know? I'm discovering things from my childhood. And I'm trying to reach that conclusion, whether this is innate or not, but I wouldn't rule out either possibility, you know? I also had a lot of nightmares, but of course, I don't know to what extent that's normal for kids or not.
How many years have you been involved in mediumship, or since you realized you were a medium and all that?
Well, very, 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 very little. Almost 2 years, not quite 2 years yet. Since March of last year. No, not last year. Since March 2023.
Well, for me, it took at least 5 years to start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. and to understand, like, okay, so that's what it was. Now I get it. Also to remember things that made me question things I had forgotten, but I think it's something that's there from childhood, which
That's also something that really surprises me. You know, that in 2 years, in less than 2 years, I've made such strong progress. Like now, I'm finally working part time on this. It's like West Ham. I've been doing it my whole life.
of course, because you have it innately, and when someone has it innately, they've always had it. That's classic for mediums, for real mediums, let's say. So, what's your experience? The one that has impacted you the most shocking one, the one that, tell us about that.
Well, there are many, and honestly, my memory is really bad. There's one that I always talk about, but for me, it was very important because it was one of the first intense experiences I had. These happened in the early hours from Saturday to Sunday in November 2023, if I'm not mistaken, when I kept waking up every hour and a half, startled, and I had the feeling that something had happened, with a smell of something burning as well. And at the end of that night, I dreamed about a house because I have a lot of dreams, quite a bit of dream-related mediumship. I dreamed about a house where it was like a visit, from a real estate agency. They were showing me the house and opened the window, and there was a horreo down below just to the right. I don't know if you know what that is. It's a structure from Galicia and Asturias used to store. It's old, right? To store feed and herbs and so on.
Like a basement?
No. It's a structure. It's like a little house on pillars, so it's kept away from the moisture.
Okay.
Yes, and there was one of those, which is very distinctive, which is unusual. And then I also saw a church organ. So throughout that whole week, I had the feeling of the presence of a young man, about 20 years old, red-haired. And I didn't know, in all those sessions, it didn't make sense to anyone. But in the Wednesday session, I mentioned him again, and the girl said, no, it doesn't mean anything to me. But an hour later, she writes to me, Oma, wow, I just realized that what you were describing is my friend who died many years ago when he was 20 years old, and so on. And it turns out, he was a redhead. And it turns out that this house he was showing me, I described it to her. And she says, you're describing exactly what my house is like. In fact, if I open the window, there's a granary underneath. And on the other side of the street is the church. And when there's mass, they play the organ, and you can hear it in my house. And she sent me photos and everything. So it was really surprising for me. And also, that night from Saturday to Sunday was the anniversary of the boy's death.
So, when you had the experience with him, it was his anniversary.
That's right. It was the night he had died in a car accident.
So it's like he anticipated the event. Look, he anticipated the situation. Have you noticed that usually from the other side, it's as if they arrange the pieces of the puzzle so that the perfect moment arrives? Sometimes they can show up beforehand, for people who don't know. And then you don't know. How sometimes, in a very random way, it seems almost magical. The right person appears, things like that just happen, right? Like this very particular kind of magic.
Yes, look, that happens a lot. For me, since I don't have a great memory, it often happens that I'm on my way to my regular job in the morning and suddenly I sense someone's presence next to me in my car. And I think, how strange, I don't have a session today, I don't have anything. And then, boom, it turns out I had forgotten to schedule a session, or that I was even supposed to meet with someone who wanted me to talk to their deceased loved one. And this happens, right? For example, the other day I had an interview and I kept feeling a presence for hours beforehand, but I thought, we're not going to do a mediumship session. It's just an interview to chat. And at the end of the interview, the interviewer says to me, hey, would you like to do some mediumship? Okay. Now I understand why this deceased person had been around me for so long.
Wow, that's interesting. Hey, Iker, do you always connect when you're going to have a session or not always? How do you handle that? And if you don't always connect, what do you do when you can't manage to connect?
Well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because in all the schools I've studied at, they always say that there's a 10%, maybe 20% chance of failed sessions that for some reason just don't happen. And actually, the further back I look, in time, the more failed sessions there were, the higher the probability of failure. Maybe it's like you keep perfecting your technique, you start fine-tuning things, and you begin to realize what the mistakes are or why the communication isn't coming through. And honestly, knock on wood, but lately there haven't been any failed sessions. It is true, though, that there are sessions where I feel like the deceased doesn't like me and doesn't want to talk to me. So if this happens, I just tell them, look, I'll give you your money back, find another medium, I can recommend someone. Because I really do feel that sometimes there are deceased people who just don't want to, that I'm not the right medium for them, you know? But in general, honestly, there are very few sessions that fail. Also, I want to share something. I'm going to be honest, because I think it's important for other mediums as well. There's something that used to happen to me, and it's really an ego thing, something about my own self, you know? When a client wasn't the way I wanted, or didn't meet my expectations, or didn't smile, or didn't seem like a pleasant person to me, I would just shut down, you know? I would shut down unconsciously. So I would get really poor evidence, and all of this would cause the session to fail. Once I addressed this and realized that it can be reversed, well, I've improved a lot in this area, because what happens? Sometimes people come in with a lot of pain, and that pain doesn't let you smile. It doesn't let you be a cheerful person. So by overcoming this barrier, right, of that serious face they might have at first, usually once there is some evidential proof that says, okay, yes, that's my son, that's when they can finally open that door of intimacy, because in the end, we're dealing with things that are very, very personal to people.
Of course. You know, I've heard mediums say that the client or the client's attitude affects the success or failure of a session. And I agree with you. I don't think the client has anything to do with that, because I've had experiences with clients who are not very empathetic, and things still work out very well, or who are very skeptical, and those are actually the best sessions, because they're so surprised when a session goes really well, clearly. And I tend to think that in those cases it's more about the medium who has some kind of conflict, right? And the medium ends up blocking themselves, getting into a kind of complicated situation, of course, because it's not very pleasant when you have someone who has that attitude, you know, sort of questioning you a bit. But I think it's important to understand that no, it doesn't have anything to do with that. And if the session is meant to happen, it will happen anyway, no matter who it's with. Now, what I also see is that there are sessions that not all sessions are the same, and you know that, right? There are sessions where things flow much better and you're much more, and there are others that are more difficult, and others where, at least for me, nothing happens at all. I feel that it's natural for it not to happen. I mean, if there's someone who's a medium and is watching this, it's natural that sometimes you just can't connect, because this is like arranging a meeting. Not everyone is always going to be able or willing to be at the meeting.
Of course.
There has to be a reason for them to be there too.
Yes, that's it. Sometimes I think, well, maybe they're doing something more important that right now we can't see, something that truly matters more than what's happening here, but that's just how it is. And there are also times when the clients are just too fixated or go from medium to medium, looking for an answer that they're never going to find. So in these cases, it also seems like the deceased is saying, no, it's not the right time for you to have a session. And then this thing that I talk about, I talk a lot. And
No, go ahead and talk. You're the interviewee after all.
Look, this week, last Monday, I had a client who at first seemed complicated. As soon as we started, he would close his eyes. And I explained to him, look, usually I'm the one who closes my eyes to concentrate. And he said to me, of course, but I also want to put all my energy into this, and I want it to go well. And I was like, all right, it's true. It seems strange to me, but it's true. And he was very serious. He didn't get very emotional with the tests, which I actually really like. Maybe I enjoy the drama. So it was like, okay, I'll allow it. I agree that if you want to approach it that way, that's fine. In fact, halfway through the session, I asked him, what are you expecting from this session? Because I had the feeling that he had something internal, a blockage, some anger. So I asked, what are you expecting from the session? What do you need from all of this? And I also told him, look, you are the most serious client I've ever had. And that was like, boom, it opened the door, broke down some of that seriousness. And it actually turned out to be a really beautiful session, full of very strong evidential proofs. But yes, it's just like you said. And I also wanted to tell you something else. Yes, there's also something I've noticed. That happens to me, which is when I don't like the client. And I start judging them, like, what a blonde lady, how posh, how old, how young, how old. When I have this kind of internal dialogue, it's as if their own deceased relatives are listening to it and saying, dude, you're an idiot. I don't want to talk to you at all. This is also something I've worked on, and it seems to be working really well. Doing it from a place of genuine love, not superficial love.
You know, when I have sessions, I almost never look at the client. I'm always looking at the floor, or so I don't let myself be influenced by their expressions or their attitude. I'm kind of here and there, and I just transmit, but I'm not really paying attention to how they are. Of course, sometimes I look when it's more empathetic, but I try not to look too much, At least for me, that helps. Hey, and that experience with the person who was very serious, was that the most complex experience you've had with mediumship? Or have you had any others that you could describe as very complex?
There are more complex ones, yes. I'm thinking about what I can share and what I can't, but I think this is something I can talk about. Look, I went through a period of about 2 weeks where I had sessions with people who had passed away, and those sessions happened because they had taken their own lives. And either the cause of death wasn't clear, or the person consulting me, their family member or loved one, didn't want to face that reality. So these were sessions where I would immediately sense that they had taken their own lives, the way in which they had done it, and so on. So I would ask, could it be that he decided to end his life or stop living? And there was the last one, where she started crying and told me, that's what I wanted to hear. What's going on? Since I generally don't have filters, it's really hard for me to filter things. I imagine that's why the deceased also seek me out, to deliver the bad news or the things that really need to be said. There are mediums who say, no, you have to filter. There are things we're shown that we shouldn't say. But of course, I think if they're showing us these things, it's for a reason. If they're investing their energy to make this come through, it must be for a reason. So I let myself be guided by that. And honestly, it was a very intense experience, because I also described to her how he had tied a rope to his ankle to sink himself. And she confirmed to me that the police had told her there was a rope mark on his ankle.
You see, yes. Notice that I also used to make the mistake when I started of filtering things, but it's really absurd, because first of all, we're not going to understand the context. We only have limited information from the experience. So there are things that might not seem so relevant to us, but for the person consulting, they are. But there are things for us that I think must be communicated. I think you should communicate everything you perceive, as long as you're truly well connected and you know that you are well connected. That's my impression, right?
Exactly.
Hey, and
You're sure you're connected, yes.
yes. And try not to ask so many questions, but rather to say more. What do you think, Bis, about the messages in mediumistic experiences? Are the messages important? What do you think? Because there are mediums who believe that it's enough to they just give information or evidence of life, no? And with that, the session is considered successful. I have a different impression, but what do you think about that?
Look, I try to build my own mediumship based on certain mistakes or on my own way of being. I don't let myself be guided by a doctrine that says, well, it has to be this way, but instead I try to find a way that works. And I've always received messages. They're not messages that fill an entire page, but usually 2 or 3 lines. I especially take a short break during the session, and in that break, I take the opportunity to channel something. In fact, many times I end up with a different handwriting that has nothing to do with mine, much prettier. So, how could I not say it? Above all, I tell the client because I see that it makes sense. 90% of the time, these texts make a lot of sense. So, if messages need to be given, then they are given. I'm in favor of this. It is true, though, that there needs to be a solid foundation of evidence, a solid base showing that the session is going well, and maybe halfway through, or a little later. Introduce these messages.
Yes, I agree with you. But notice that there are mediums, and the most extraordinary mediums I've seen, which have been very few, just 2, I would say. And they're not the most famous ones. And notice that they usually give messages, Bimo, but the messages are so specific that the evidence is contained within the message itself, in everything. Do you understand? It's like...
That's right.
So it's not like they make a division, like, I'm going to give evidence of life and then messages, but rather it's like they weave a story, and within that story, all the evidence is included. But yes, people who connect very much through clairvoyance in general, very powerfully, yes.
That's what I always try to do, you know? So I'm with Aunt Maria, for example. Well, that's kind of key, right? Their aunt has to be deceased and her name has to be Maria. I always try to make sure that message is that it has an element of evidence, yes.
Of course. And what do you think about what do you think about, because I've seen out there on social media that there are people who do like mediumship sessions, but they only give evidence. But what do you think about that?
Just like with people, I think there's nothing that's 100% correct, nor does what I'm doing have to be what everyone else should do. So it's kind of like communication between people. There are people who speak one way, others who criticize a lot, others who only say nice things. So for me, everything is fine, as long as the deceased provide that evidence. And above all, if the client feels that connection, which is what's important, right? And it helps them in their life. Of course, I find it very respectable because I've spent a lot of time doing many sessions like that, you know, with just evidence. But for me, there's still something missing. It's true. What really surprises me is that there are many clients who are looking for Mosamint, the message, above all, the message. Instead of relying on evidence, it's the message they want. Do you have a message for me? I don't know who. So I suppose this is because of beliefs that predate spiritualism, or rather from spiritualism and all those things. But then for me, I don't like to focus so much on this when someone asks me, is there a message? Yes, your dad says he's very proud of you and loves you very much, that you're doing really well. For me, that feels incomplete.
Yes, but that can be very important for someone. For me, it feels incomplete, for example, when people only give evidence. Like, oh, yesterday you put your shoes on the wrong feet. I don't believe. They come from the beyond just to give facts and not to convey anything deeper than that. So that's why I think the messages are very key. And I say this from my own experience because I also spent years working by only giving facts and not getting into the messages until suddenly I opened my mind a bit and realized you have to go with the flow, however it comes naturally to you, without having any structure. And when you do it that way, it's perfect.
Of course, yes. If they tell them this or that, how am I supposed to refuse that, you know?
Besides, there isn't a guru to follow, nor is there a correct way to practice mediumship. At least from my point of view. From your point of view, do you think there is a correct way to practice mediumship?
Yes. There is a correct way, which is from a place of respect and love. Anything that prioritizes the financial aspect or the ego, I would set aside and not call it mediumship.
Exactly, yes. In that sense, we agree, but there isn't really a structure, a single correct way, like this is the way, and you can't deviate from it. Because if you do, it's not the same anymore. I don't know.
For me, it's like talking between people. So someone might get really annoyed because this person is dropping the letter R, for example, because they have a problem with their P vocal apparatus, right? And they say they're dropping the letter R, and there might be someone who gets really bothered that they can't say raton the way it sounds, right? But the thing is, each of us is a different person, no? And for example, that's how dialects or languages are born, right? From mistakes or from things that aren't correct.
That's right. No, I think mediumship is something alive, and you can't make it into a structure or a form or when from my perspective, when you add too much structure and form, what you end up doing is kind of losing the ability to connect with from mediumship, from who you are, which isn't mental, isn't rational, and isn't structured. When people start working too much with structure, they end up limiting themselves, at least in this field, because this field isn't physics, it's not construction engineering or metallurgy, right? Where you have a mathematical structure. This isn't like that. This is much more open,
Yes, in fact, look, there's a lot in the courses, right, that I've taken. They give you these test tables, things you can turn to in order to conduct a session. But there are even some that are organized to guide you through the session. And there are people who, especially at the beginning, right, would do test 1. They'd ask the consul, the deceased, tell me such and such. Try 2, I don't know what. Of course, this makes it completely unnatural. It's like an interrogation.
Right. Imagine you're on the other side. You want to connect with your loved one, and what you get is an interrogation like that. Yes, it's impossible. It's true. It's true. Hey, and how do you tell the difference? Can you tell the difference? Do you know the difference, for example, between when you connect mediumistically and when you're connecting psychically?
No, I'm new to this. No, and I don't really know much about it. For me, what I mainly try to do is to make sure they're tests from the deceased, evidence from the deceased, not from the client. I try not to give more than 3 pieces of evidence or so that refer to posthumous proofs or things about the client. But I'm not a master, nor do I have this theory completely learned. Honestly, I'm more of a beginner, and I don't really know how to tell one thing from the other.
But a beginner who, from what I've seen, has a lot of potential. Objectively, yes, but I mean that I'm not involved in spirituality, in all of this, in this world. So, of course, there's a lot of information I'm missing. Yes, but for example, field reading has nothing to do with spirituality. It's part of extrasensory perception. We can connect with a person's information field and obtain information, and we can also connect mediumistically with a third party, which is something else. And the difference, generally speaking, is that when we connect with a third party, we sense a source of information that is different from the client. We feel an emotionality, an emotional charge in what is being transmitted to you. Many times we feel a sense of presence. And when we connect psychically, no monestes makikiting, we receive information, but we don't feel this third party. We don't feel that it's coming from an external source. Often we can't recognize the source. And besides that, it's cold and harsh. I have information, but I don't know from whom or where it comes from. And it's information that carries no emotional charge and is usually transcendent.
It must be mediumship that I practice, because I almost always feel a sense of presence, always there, a presence. So your grandfather comes, your father comes, a child comes. So there's a lot of emotional charge because I'm very empathetic, and they show me this. Every time I have to talk about a topic, about a test, I say this person is feeling it in a sad way. For example, they're talking to me about this suitcase, but they're speaking about it in a sad way. And I also have a lot of that. They show me their cause of death in a very clear way. It's not a stroke, not a headache, but I feel it in my body. That's it. Cancer is a very specific code, pain in the heart. So I understand that this is mediumship because of this, and especially because I have a lot of conversation with the deceased. Please show me what you like to do. Show me what your profession was, when you were born. So I understand that it is mediumship because of this, because there is a conversation.
Look, in the past, at the beginning, when I started, I used to do pretty much the same as you. Like, I tried to interrogate, but in recent years, I don't really interrogate anymore. Things just come to me, wrong. And I don't know how you do it. No? But usually at the beginning, I go in with structure, personality, like I feel an older person than you. 1 generation, 2 generations older, female. I first try to understand the cause of death, whether it was something quick or slow, abrupt or not. I feel the sensation in the body. And I associate those sensations with certain illnesses. For example, pancreatic cancer, or a brain aneurysm, because that's something experience gives you. And finally, what happens is that basically that's how it starts. And this feeling of, like who it is, let's say. And sometimes because names can also appear, not always coming up here and there, and it's like that opens the doors. But before I used to ask, and now look, it just comes on its own. Madam, that's it. Mediumship is always changing. For those watching here, it's never the same. It's not static.
And what works for you today, tomorrow you might need something different. Exactly. My start is it's the same. I try to identify with those pieces of evidence. Cause of death, names, and dates. For me, that's the most important thing for identification. And then I do about half. I start asking questions to try to identify as much as possible. And it's true that for about half, I try to let them, I call it free time. It's, now tell me whatever you need. Because it's true that if we control the whole session and they want to talk to us about the forest where there's a box buried with, I don't know, gold, then we're really limiting them.
Of course. And I think in the end, you just have to let things flow. That's all. Over time, I've realized that you have to let what you perceive flow. You say it, and that's it. There's nothing more to it than that. And look, regarding psychic readings, it catches my attention because I see a lot of sessions that are just evidence of life. Someone who manages to develop psychic reading, can provide very good evidence of life. And in psychic reading, there is no message. That catches my attention. So it's something like or I think sometimes people are trained, or there are people who confuse psychic ability with mediumship because that's how they've been taught. You see?
Yes. I don't even think in many cases it's done with bad intentions. It's just that, no, of course.
No, of course, that's not how I learned. And if you learn that way and you get feedback, you'll think you're a medium, but maybe you're not. And psychic readings aren't bad at all, but they're good for therapists or other types of work. But it's not mediumship.
Honestly, I don't get into that debate because everyone is free to do things their own way. And I'm not a judge, so...
Of course. Hey, and what do you think about other ways of approaching mediumship? For example, like the Spiritist or Umbanda in perspective, where mediumship is also an integral part of their practices, let's say.
Well, fortunately in my life, I never claim anything with 100% certainty, and I never close myself off to anything. So the kind of mediumship that has allowed me to enter this world is evidential and secular mediumship. So for me, it's very important that it remains that way. But I can criticize other ways of connecting with the deceased because everyone has their own. And I understand that if Allan Kardec received this information and so on, it wasn't by chance. So I don't know too much about the spiritual past, about the history of mediums. Honestly, I try not to have too much information about that, so I don't get influenced, and I always try to find my own way of practicing mediumship, the way I feel it, and the way I'm also guided. So honestly, I don't know what other ways there are to communicate with the deceased.
Yes, I find it interesting. Look, it's clear that everyone has their own way, and the main thing here is self-knowledge, understanding how you work, and flowing from there. But I also find it interesting to understand how others work, whether or not I share their perspective, because they exist and they're different ways, and I've had the chance to share with them. It's different, but that doesn't make it any less valid, so to speak. In fact, in Brazil, there are an extraordinary number of mediums. It's unbelievable. Every spiritualist center has 12 mediums, 15 mediums, and there are hundreds, thousands. It's incredible. Iker, do you think a medium is born or made?
For me, currently, with the information I have, it can be done. What happens is that it's like a violinist, for example, who is born with an innate talent, who at 5 or 6 years old can play a sonata as if they've been playing the violin their whole life, because they need a bit of training. And another big part is innate ability. So there are mediums who study a lot, who have taken all the courses, and they stay at a 5 or a 6, and others who with hardly any study and more innate ability, maybe easily reach a 10, if we were using a scale from 1 to 10. So I understand this because there is a part that we are born with, but it's something I haven't fully developed. I don't have a fully formed theory about it. So that's what I think right now, as of today.
I used to think the same way as you, In fact, I developed mediumship training courses, and for many years I taught them, but over time I got the impression that in the end someone is born with it due to a series of factors, and because those I've met who are truly powerful have always had childhood experiences. So far I haven't come across anyone who was absolutely 0, 0, 0, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, became a medium. That just hasn't happened to me yet. And I was watching an interview with John Edward, who's a pretty famous medium, and he thought the same way, but eventually he kind of changed his mind. But anyway, it's a debatable topic, let's say.
Of course, I like that. I like when it happens, and I like to investigate it and test it. If I don't see it, I don't believe it. So I need to put it to the test. Now that next month my training with 30 people is starting, that's when I'll find out if people are really born with it or not.
Great, I think that's awesome. Hey, is there any recurring message from the spirits when you connect in a session? Is there something they tend to say that's kind of a recurring message?
Yes. In my experience, it's very important for the deceased to say, I've arrived safely, I'm okay, I'm also not alone. They almost always show me, yes, I'm with grandma or whoever, oh, I'm with dad. So this is something very common, honestly. Since I love pets, they also tend to show up. I'm with this dog, for example. Above all, it's this. Many of the deceased also need one, to express where they are or what their life is like now, where they're anchored, where they spend their time, and especially whether they're accompanying, whether they're watching over day-to-day life, whether they're helping, whether they're acting as guides. Also, what often happens in the sessions, this isn't really related, but I want to mention it, is that the deceased says exactly what the person consulting needs to hear. For example, if they're suffering from depression and need encouragement, need something to help them get out of that state, that's what will happen. If they're taking a competitive exam and have no confidence in themselves and need support, it's as if everything is set up. This show is prepared so that the person consulting can move forward with whatever situation they're facing. In other words, it's like there's a reason for everything, as if there were a purpose behind it all. I won't interrupt you anymore.
I think the purpose of the sessions, ultimately, and the purpose of the messages is just that. It's like providing evidence, showing that we are still alive. And in the end, the messages are meant to heal those who are still here. Because I don't know what you think, but I get the impression that the people who have passed on aren't the ones most troubled by their departure. It's more those of us who are still here than those who have gone. At least that's how I see it. When you see animals, do you see them arriving with their owner, or do they sometimes, or just appear to you like a dog or a cat, and you're like, who is this one? How did it show up? That's one thing. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you is how why how do you think the afterlife is? What is the afterlife like for you based on your experience?
Hmm. Well, with animals, it happens to me like it does with children. They almost always come accompanied by another person, by an adult, by someone who is responsible for them and who who accompanies them or spends this time with them, you know? Um, so yes, most of the time dogs appear accompanied by another person, by a loved one. For me, this is something that people give a lot of importance to, you know? And how do they tell you about this? How do they show it to you? But I don't know why I don't give much importance to this. It's not really something that catches my attention. The feeling of what the afterlife is like is that it's a love that's immense. It's a place, above all, where we don't have physical pain. We're not dragging our bodies around, suffering from illnesses and so on. And most of the negative things, negative emotions that we have in the body disappear. It is true that I don't see it all as a world full of little hearts and everything perfect, but sometimes I also feel that they feel guilty, that they feel ashamed about something they've done, that they need to ask for forgiveness, and above all that they're worried, you know, because of someone among the living who is having a hard time, who they see isn't moving forward, who is stuck in a rut. So, what is the afterlife like? For me, what they almost always tend to show me is their childhood village, the place where they were happiest, the house where their wife lives and where he keeps her company. This is usually what the afterlife is for my deceased.
Excellent. And the children, for example, that you have received, deceased children, right? From the afterlife, do they remain children in your experience? Or does it happen that they passed away as children and now they are adults? How does that work?
Well, in my case, most children come through at the same age they were. It is true, though, that when there are babies who passed away, they are often shown as being 4 or 5 years older. It's as if they've grown a little bit more, but they don't appear as 40-year-olds, for example. If they were born as babies, they usually show themselves to me as babies. And it's similar to what happens with animals, you know? Almost always there's an adult responsible who brings them in their arms, for example. It's like a code I have with them. In cases of miscarriages and very young babies.
But what happens when a child passed away at 7 years old, but 40 years have gone by? They should be 47 here. How do you experience that? Or have you not had experiences like that?
Well, I have someone very close to me who died at 5 years old. And almost every time other mediums have seen her, they've seen her the same way, as a little girl, very small, 4 or 5 years old. So at first it's true that I thought they kept growing, but it's not a theory that I've developed much or that carries much weight in my sessions. So for now, I think that they remain around the age they were when they passed away, because in the end, what they show you is a representation. There are women who die at 100 years old, like my grandmother, who are very vain and will take 30 or 40 years of their appearance, because what they're really showing you is a graphic representation. It's not how they actually are now.
Exactly. That's what I think too, because they're going to present themselves in a way that people will recognize them as they were, you know? So if you perceive a child or someone who passed away as a child 40 years ago and would be 47 now, and you say, look, I sense a man who seems to be about 47 years old, people aren't going to associate that with the child who passed away at 7. So they'll present themselves as they were when they were children, but then you might sense that they're already adults, that they're in a different stage. I mean, and vice versa. Someone might present themselves as a grandfather of 90 or 100 years old, but it's not that he's actually 100 years old or lives like a 100-year-old person on the other side, right? It's more like a representation, just as you said.
Of course. Yes, what they do tend to show is their personality, right? If they were people who passed away at 100 years old but were very lively, then that's how they'll appear. If the grandmother smoked and loved going to bingo, then she'll bring that same energy. And with animals, it's kind of the same thing, right? They don't present themselves with a more limited consciousness, but rather, for me, it's just like connecting with a deceased person. It's the same level of consciousness.
Animals Ah, I see. Do you see them as having a level of consciousness developed like that of a human being?
Like, yes, like an energy in which an inner, like an energy that can give you information.
Right? Perfect. You know, sometimes I think or feel, lately I say I feel more than I think, because it's hard. I have no way to prove it, but I feel that on the other side, they are, maybe they're not going to keep being the way they were here, but they will show themselves as they were, so that they can be recognized, but their consciousness expands. It's another way of understanding it. If they come here, it's to help those who are still here, and maybe to close some kind of cycle. That's how I understand it. Iker, for you, are all people on the same level, on the same plane, in the same place? Or do you think there are different levels on the other side, according to your experience?
Mm. Well, the truth is that they've never shown me that there are different levels, like level 7, level 8. No, just that there is a there, no, and a here. I feel that when they come here to give us this information, they use up a lot of energy, and this energy is limited, so they have to go back to their place to recharge it, kind of like we do with sleep, right? With sleeping, what I feel is that there is a there and a here.
Okay. But even if there aren't like level 7 or 5, do you understand that sometimes they're in different states, in different contexts, or rather in different states, right?
In states of emotional states, most, right? Someone who is very worried. Or the other day I had an elderly lady who said, I had already done everything I needed to do. I'm happy with my life, and I just wanted to go. So it's very noticeable when there's someone deceased who has something unresolved, who wants to say something, wants to help someone, and another who says, no, now let them go on with their lives. I've already done everything. Do you see the deceased with your eyes? Do you see the deceased with your eyes?
I have seen, not always, but yes, I have seen them with my eyes and in my mind. Yes, both ways.
And as a person, do they appear as people with a human form?
Well, generally, yes. Yes.
Because I think that if they need this energy, it must be really costly for them to show this graphic representation, right? Because in reality, you're not actually seeing them, but rather the representation they're sending you.
Of course, it's not that they're in the physical space, but notice that it's really interesting because you see them just like I can see you. But obviously, you immediately realize that it's not physical. And do you know why you see them? I used to ask myself, why do I see this person who clearly looks like someone physical, but why did I immediately understand that it wasn't physical, it wasn't material? And do you know why that is? Because they don't have light and shadow. Do you understand? If a light hits me here, I have a shadow here, but they don't. There could be a huge light source and it doesn't affect them. No light or shadow, but you see them just like I can see you. There's something there, like it seems like a montage, a hologram, something, one layer over another.
Right. Yeah, look, I've even come to think that these are representations they create through our heads, through our minds, that in reality, there's not someone alive next to you who can see them too, because it's just a representation. It's like when I hear their voice in a session.
That's right.
I have those even though I've asked them a billion times to let me see them with my eyes, but no.
It hasn't happened to you yet. It will happen to you soon.
No.
I mean, it happens.
And with the third eye, it's so clear.
It's something that happens when, it's not that it always happens, it happens during certain periods, and it depends on how you are, on what you're experiencing. Do you think a medium can only be a medium, or can they be something more than just a medium? I mean, should a medium limit themselves to just that, or do they have the potential to develop for example, other psychic abilities that go beyond mediumship?
Well, I think being a medium shouldn't limit you to doing just one specific thing, but rather it's even something that can be temporary. It could be that you spend 20 years of your life dedicated to this, fully immersed in mediumship, and then you no longer want to do it. You want to be a baker, and to me, that's perfectly fine. In fact, right now I'm working part-time in this, and part-time in something else that's completely normal and material, and I'm happy because I don't depend on mediumship to make a living, you know? It's just one part. And I think it's important that when we I think it's important that when we depend solely on mediumship to make a living, we might feel the need to embellish things, to invest a lot in advertising, to commercialize it too much, perhaps. I don't know why this comes to me, but...
And what do you think about now that basically with social media and the explosion of mediums out there, there are so many now? Before, no, this is something from, I'd say about 3 or 4 years ago, that you see mediums everywhere.
Since COVID, I think that with COVID, everything virtual and digital there's been kind of an explosion, right? Like a resurgence. I think it's necessary. I think we need a lot more mediums because there are too many deceased people needing to talk to the living and many living people who need to talk to the deceased. So for me, any mediums who want to come forward, who want to discover themselves, who want to train are welcome.
If you had to demystify mediumship, what would you address? How would you demystify it?
I would demystify it. Wow, what a deep question. Well, I think I would demystify it mainly by showing how mediumship can be practiced in a completely natural way. Like when you're going out to buy bread and you run into your neighbor and say, look, I'm seeing your husband. He's telling me that he's fine, and so on. For me, that's a way to demystify it, making it something more everyday, more part of daily life, something that doesn't require you to light a candle, schedule a private session, burn incense, or any of those things. For me, it's important to remove all this decoration that has perhaps been added to mediumship over many years. To me, mediumship will be the WhatsApp of the 22nd century. So it's a way that in the future, communicating with each other will surely be something common.
From what I understand, or from what you're saying, you don't have any kind of ritual before a session. Do you prepare yourself in any way or not?
Well, I've tried everything. I've tried meditating. I've tried spending 15 minutes in sensory deprivation to see what I would receive. And I've tried incense, candles, crystal balls, pendulums.
Right, like a sorcerer. Yeah.
Yes. Just to see what happens, you know, to see how things come through with that. I've tried all these things because, as I mentioned before, I really like research. I like testing what works and what doesn't. So I've tried everything, but honestly, what I stick with is just the naturalness of opening your computer and being calm. For me, it's important that your heart rate is as calm as possible, and just talk like we're talking to someone we run into on the street.
Of course. Then, well, I would say that the main thing is just to try to calm your mind a bit. I mean, you can't have a good session if your kid is yelling next to you, or if you're thinking about needing to go to the bank.
Right, but that's the same as with anything else, isn't it? To make a piece of carpentry, if you're thinking about something else the whole time while you're doing it, well, you might end up cutting a finger, right? So for this, it's the same. You need the same thing to have a good session.
Concentration, exactly. And what do you think about technology with this technological boom and everything that's happening and everything related to the invisible, to mediumship? Do you see any kind of integration from the beyond? Can they use technology?
Absolutely. In fact, something happened yesterday. Yesterday, I'll tell you a very clear example of what happened yesterday. Yesterday, I had a live session about grief with Carolina, and we were, her daughter was the link, the connection, right? Who appeared in a session. She passed away when she was very little and all that. So we were doing the live on Instagram, and at the top, it kept showing 1,101 followers. And around that, it would go down and up, 11 all the time, right? It would drop by 10. At most, it would go up by 10. So there comes a moment when suddenly it drops to 40. And then a second later, it goes back up to 11. So it was like, how strange. And then I realized that there were hardly any comments. So if there were 1,000 people connected to the live, there would be tons more, but there was only one comment every minute, so often. So I said, wow, you know what? I think your daughter Sophie is showing herself through the numbers, and it was about 10 numbers below. So I said, this live, it's recorded. I said, please, Sophie, can you bring it back up to 1111 again? And you. In 5 seconds, it had gone back up to 1111, and
Your mind was blown, but what an incredible story. That's awesome.
it's really intense. And since this morning, I've downloaded the live video to try to show it to my people, to my followers. But it turns out the little follower count doesn't show up in the recordings of the live. So it was like, what a shame I can't show it, but I guess it has to be that way. And I'm also going to tell you something else that happened to me about a month ago, which was intense and involved technology. So I was at the place where the girl who does my eyebrows works, and we were talking, She didn't know I was a medium, and we were talking about this, and she says, wow, I'd like to know something about my father. But then she says, but we'll talk about it later, because it really scares me, and I don't want to know anything for now. So half an hour later, I went back to her shop to pay her. And when I was at the door, she was sending one of those voice messages that gets converted to text to someone else. And I said something like, tonight, or something about the fronton, right? I wanted to talk about the fronton. And for some reason, instead of writing fronton, it wrote Antonio. And I was like, wow, that's strange, Antonio. Why did it write that? It crossed my mind, a little light bulb went off, and I thought, wow, maybe that's the name of the girl's father. And when she opened the door, I asked her, hey, your father's name wouldn't happen to be Antonio, would it? She just stood there. She said, yes, why? I said, look. I showed her the conversation. She turned pale, she really turned pale, and so did I, of course. It was amazing.
The probability of that happening by chance out of thousands and thousands of names is incredibly low.
Of course, my partner, who is very skeptical and really keeps me grounded, he told me, but it could happen. Sometimes these things mess up, sometimes they make mistakes and just put whatever they want.
But for it to be a name?
Yeah, but for it to say this one had actually been talking.
10,000 names, that's 1 in 10,000, and there are more than that. Maybe 100,000 names, that's a 0.01% chance.
So seeing this, I think that in 2023, the day that this medium showed up for me on TikTok doing mediumship, it wasn't a coincidence. When people come across me, it's by chance while scrolling on TikTok, but it's not just a coincidence either. So it opens up a world of incredible possibilities.
Once a friend of mine was in a session. She was with another friend. We used to do joint sessions, and there were some clients. 2 people had invited their father. He was sitting there, and these 2 women hadn't told their father what he was there for. So he didn't know. My friend started to explain what the session was about. This was in person, and she had left her iPhone there charging next to her. And suddenly she explained, and the man said something like, oh, so you're going to tell me that you connect with the dead? He said it kind of seriously. And you know what? Siri on the iPhone activated and said, very good question, Claudia. And we were all like, what? Siri, the iPhone assistant. And it was there charging, unplugged. You see?
Right. Besides, it's not easy for it to activate because you have to say, hey, Siri.
And on top of that, very good question, Claudia. It was like, and it happened right at that moment. So everyone was just like, things happen.
Totally.
That also happened to me with a friend. We were in her car and talking about something, and she has a modern car, and the car also talks, right? It gives instructions. And suddenly it said something related to our conversation, but clearly we hadn't asked the car anything, And the same thing happened to us. Yeah, incredible things happen with technology.
Yeah, now I'm remembering. This was about 3 months ago. I was in the car leaving my house, and suddenly on the screen of my car, on the radio screen, the number for 112 showed up, which I have saved for quick access. And I thought, that's strange. Why did 112 get dialed? And I turned it off. And then I got this feeling like be careful, like an accident. And 2 minutes later, there was a brutal accident with an overturned truck right in front of me. So many things can happen.
One time
And I have more. Honestly, technology does this to me a lot.
once I was giving an in-person workshop on extrasensory perception before the pandemic, and we did an exercise with images, and we would distribute the images without knowing whose was whose. So you would look at a person, you had to describe them, and you had to say who you thought they belonged to, who the person in the image was connected to. And what happened was that a girl brought a picture of, I can't remember if it was her mother or her grandmother, and she gave it to me, and I gave it to someone else. That person did the reading and all that. Then suddenly we saw that the girl got really emotional and started to cry. And what had happened was that she had received a WhatsApp message, if I remember correctly, yes, WhatsApp from her mother's WhatsApp account. The mother who had passed away, the one in the photo. And it was like a message, and well, it's not comfortable, and she showed us that, and it was like, what is all this? Incredible.
And calls too. Once a girl told me that the night after her father passed away, she woke up in the morning and had 3 or 4 missed calls from him after he had died from his phone.
Incredible. So, Iker, what would you tell someone to look out for so they don't fall into the hands of a fraud, a fake medium?
For me, the most important thing when hiring a medium is that you can see their work, that there is some way for them to prove it. Just like if I want to hire a carpenter, I would like to see photos on their website of the work they've done. For me, that's important. You could also look at reviews like on Google Maps or things like that. And something very important is your instinct, because that's what will guide you the most toward who you focus on. If I'm not mistaken, you don't post your work on social media, right?
I don't know. No, I posted a couple at the beginning, but then I stopped because I have my reservations about that. You know what I mean? At first I posted, there are a couple of mine up there, but then I didn't post anymore because I have my reservations about it. I have my personal reservations.
Okay.
And, I also think word of mouth is super important. I mean, if someone recommends a medium to you because they had an experience with that person and it's someone you trust, that's good. Maybe that's the most, I think that's the best, let's say, the most advisable.
Yes.
If there's word of mouth.
Yes, but word of mouth can also be misleading because your experience might have been wonderful and someone else's might not have been.
But when it's someone you trust and know, it's safer. And well, you can check a recommendation and see if they have something on social media and get a sense of the person's profile and whether it resonates with you or not. But for me, word of mouth is key.
I'm also I'm also very divided, in this dilemma between showing this or not showing it, because I understand these are very intimate things, and that many times we tend towards sensationalism to get more followers, right? So it's true that I needed it because my goal when I got on social media was to be able to work in this, it was to be able to continue being a medium and to be able to grow. So it's true that I posted sessions mainly for that reason. Once I already have a waiting list and I get overwhelmed because I can't get to everyone, then it doesn't really make much sense to keep posting, to keep uploading videos. But on the other hand, if you share your work, you also broaden the field so that more people can approach this and see that it comes from love, see that it's much more natural. So it's a bit of a balance. That's not so easy, right? To tip it to one side or the other.
I think that when people are meant to find you, they'll find you one way or another. There are things that we don't arrange ourselves. I think a lot is arranged from the other side. And on the other hand, I think that exposing people in emotionally intense situations and in very intimate moments, I have a conflict with that because I find it often gets trivialized, which is why it makes me feel a bit uneasy, I try not to watch them, the ones that are out there, and for the same reason, I don't upload my own, so to speak.
Right? I try not to post anything too intimate from the session. It's true that at first I let myself get carried away by that ego. That draws me toward drama, you know? But I try to make sure they're not intimate moments. For example, the case I mentioned earlier about the suicide of this young man, which was very impactful, and the client cried in a way that I had no idea what to do because I wasn't prepared for that situation. Well, obviously that session is something for her to remember and nothing more. But I also think it's necessary to show people what mediumship really is.
Thinking about someone who might be accompanying a person who is about to pass away, someone who is already terminal, and so on, from your experience, what would you recommend to someone in that situation? How can they accompany you? How can they go through that process?
Well, I'm not an expert in grief, nor do I have many close people who have passed away. But for me, the most important thing would be to accompany without judging, to be there without expecting things to be any different. For example, if it's the moment when they have to pass away and that person needs to rest because they've been suffering for a long time, we have to try not to. Let ourselves be guided by our personal ego and say, no, I don't want you to go. It's going to hurt me too much. We have to accept that they're leaving and allow it. It's very important to allow the person to leave their body, because otherwise it creates a very conflicted situation at that moment of passing, right? I'm remembering a farewell I helped with about 4 or 5 months ago, where what I mainly did was talk to him openly, tell him to be at peace, that his loved ones were waiting for him there. Although I believe that we are prepared hours before death, I think they prepare us and show us who will be there. So what I did was this: I told him, don't worry, come. Your mother is here, your grandparents are here. Let yourself be guided. Everything that's there, everything that's waiting for you is going to be much more positive.
Yes. It's important for people to understand that you can also connect with them telepathically during those processes. And I would also add that in that moment, if someone is going through that experience, they should take the opportunity to be honest, to say how much they love them, to forgive themselves, to express themselves. Because if that isn't done, if things are left unsaid, it can later create a conflict during the grieving process, and then they'll have to come from the other side to try to bring closure. It's better, if you can, to find closure beforehand, to be honest and say everything that needs to be said from a place of love. Obviously, take advantage of it because it's incredibly valuable in that moment.
Absolutely. That would be the emotional task that we should all do.
That's right. Iker, how would you like your death to be? Have you ever thought about that?
Yes, many times. Yes, for me, death, well, I've always felt drawn to death, and I've thought about this, you know. I would like it to be a death in bed while sleeping, of course. I'm absolutely sure about that. I don't want to die in an accident. I don't want to fall off a mountain. I don't want there to be physical suffering, above all.
So like you're dreaming an amazing dream and you just stay there in the dream?
A heart attack, and that's it, yes.
And how do you see yourself in 5 years?
How do I see myself in 5 years? Honestly, I don't see myself. I see myself with whatever comes my way. I don't know if I'll be a medium. I don't know if I'll be a baker. I don't know if I'll be traveling around the world while making a living. I have no idea, but honestly, I'm not really worried about the future either. I let whatever has to come.
Exactly. Very open and really living in the present, enjoying what's here right now. I think that's great.
Because it has happened to me. Things in life happen to you, they change you, and they tell you, look, what you thought was going to happen, forget about that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's how it is. That's the game of life, isn't it?
After so many sessions, after seeing so many kinds of death, well, it's just that thinking about the future seems like a waste of energy to me.
Yes, well, with mediumship, you come to understand the fragility of life and how important it is to live in the moment day by day, and to tell the people you love that you love them, take the time to share, because you never know if suddenly, like, I haven't seen my son, my mother, and you say, no, tomorrow, 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 and maybe there is no tomorrow. So make the most of the moments, enjoy them, say that you love them. If you do, share it, be honest with people, don't leave things unresolved. That is super important.
That's it. That's it. And to live from a place of love. And look, something else that has become very clear, clear to me since I became a medium is that we have to enjoy our bodies. Eating, having sex, taking a trip, whatever it is. But we have to enjoy it because that's what it's for. Later we won't have it. We don't have taste buds. And what about that food you used to love so much?
It's true, you know, in sessions, it's happened to me that they say things like, I miss such and such food. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, that happens. Hey, Iker, as we wrap up, how can people who want to contact you reach you?
Well, I just created my own website, which I'm super proud of. My website is, ikertzailemedium.com. There you'll find all the information for training and for sessions. I also have to say that the waiting list is a bit long, so please don't get too frustrated. I've now added a link for anyone who wants to sign up for the waiting list, so I can call them as I open up sessions. And it's the same for the training. The training that's about Omega to start is already full, but if there's another training in the future, you can also sign up through the link.
Awesome. Dear Iker, thank you so much for joining us on this new episode of Fuera de la Matrix, and I hope we see each other again next time.
Well, Esteban, thank you so much for inviting me to your home. I felt very comfortable, and above all, I liked it because it was a deep interview, an interview focused on mediumship, and you can really tell, right? When you really know a subject and talk about it, and you can ask questions from within, it's truly appreciated.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, share this video and give us a like. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe so we can build an entertaining community where we talk about all topics related to the invisible. And before you go, this is the video I recommend to you this time. A very entertaining and quite controversial interview with perhaps one of the most famous mediums in Spain, Miquel Lizarralde. See you in the next episode.